Well, today I'm going to talk to you about biblical worldview homeschooling. My name's Heather Walton, and I just want to ask you a question. What if your only option for educating your child was a Muslim school and you're a Christian? Well, you might feel compelled to send your child to that school. I heard a story from Dan Egler of the ACSI, which is the Association of Christian Schools International. And he shared a story about a village in Africa where the only option they had to educate their children was a Muslim school. And they did want their children to have an education in reading and writing and math and all of that. And so they sent their children to this school. Now, at night, they did not actually do anything else with their children as far as that for that school. The only thing they did was obviously have dinner and that kind of thing, but then they spent the entire evening teaching their children the Bible and the scriptures and a biblical worldview. Well, every single one of those children became a Muslim. And so then ACSI went in and started a Christian school, and those families started to get their children back. But this just shows you the power of education in your child's life, because those families were working way harder than the average American family would in the evening on studying the Bible, and their children were still lost to another worldview. Well, I want to start off and tell you a little bit about myself. Like I said, my name is Heather Walton. I have a husband, Terry, and we live in Louisville, Kentucky. He's a pastor in Louisville, and we collectively have 8 children. And our youngest that are still at home are 15, 14, and actually I messed up, 15, 13, and 3. But those are the ones that are being homeschooled. And we have a grandbaby and another one due any minute now. And so that is exciting for us. I also am involved in our local homeschool support group. We have several co-ops in our homeschool system, and as well as some athletic teams and some events and some opportunities for fellowship with families. And so it's a pretty decent sized Christian homeschooling organization. We also, I have my own business, and I'm also affiliated with Renew a Nation, which is an organization that brings a biblical worldview to as many children as possible. And I have 2 homeschooling journeys, an early one with my older children, and then I went back to school and sent my kids to school and went back to school and got my degree in education, both in elementary and in special ed, and then spent a couple years in public school, and then after that started my own private Christian school, which I ran for 4 years. And it's still going, but I needed to diverge, so I began again the journey of homeschooling my younger set of children, and that's been a huge blessing. And the Lord has really used that. And so I've had experience from a lot of different angles when it comes to education, and I believe that a biblical worldview education is the most important thing that we are called to do with our children, and keeping in mind that education is not just the academics. So when we talk about a biblical worldview, first we need to think about, what is worldview? Well, a worldview is the beliefs that influence how we view the world and our decision making. And so if you were to find some bones in your backyard, especially if you're homeschooling, your kids might like to dig up things in the backyard, and they might find these bones. And being that they're really smart kids, they go, wait a minute, I don't think these are human. And what do you think they are? Well, your worldview is going to determine what you might think that those odd bones are. So if you have a secular humanistic worldview, a materialistic worldview, you might say, oh, these strange bones that don't look like a maybe a chimp, or they don't look exactly like a human, they must be a transitional form. But if you have a biblical worldview, you're going to say, well, now I don't know what those are, but I know they're not a transitional form. And so it makes a difference. The worldview, kind of the difference between looking at the Bible through the lens of everything else that you think you know, or looking at everything else through the lens of the Bible. When it comes to biblical worldview, I guess there's just some basics to it. Obviously, it can be very involved and detailed, but if you just want a short synopsis, I would say that with a biblical worldview, we believe that the Bible is inerrant and literal. And the central message is that man is fallen, but redemption is available in Jesus if we accept him as Lord. And once we do, we are to live out the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. Because biblical truths are essential to the faith, they must form the foundation of our education. So Deuteronomy 6, 6 through 9 says, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." And so a biblical worldview education, according to Deuteronomy 6, 6 through 9, would presuppose that parents are responsible for their children's education. Now, the entire culture is, in a sense, responsible, and I don't mean the entire culture of the country. I mean the entire culture of the church. But of course, at this point, Israel was the country, and it was their entire country. It was their entire culture. So they believed that everybody was responsible to pass on that next generation a biblical worldview. Another point would be that it takes place through all of life's activities. It is more than academics, it's a holistic. It has to do, if you notice, it doesn't really talk about academics in Deuteronomy 6, but it talks about loving God and loving your fellow man. It is conversational. You're going to talk about it as you go along, as you walk along, as you rise up, as you lay down, as you sit at home. Throughout all of the activities, that's a discipleship conversation. Again, the goal of this is for the next generation to love God and to love their fellow man. And parents may delegate this. As I said, it's the responsibility of the whole Christian culture at this point. At that point, it was the Israelite Hebrew culture. But we do need to be mindful of those whose worldview we allow our children to sit under, because just because somebody says they're Christian, or just because somebody is really good at what they do, that doesn't mean they're the best for our children and for their education and the best influence to disciple our children. So we should look at who is working with our children and say, is this person a good mentor? Are they good to disciple my children? Are they going to teach my children the way I would? Now, obviously, if you want to teach your child a foreign language that you don't know and you outsource that you may not be able to teach that subject as well as that other person. But what other messages are they going to receive along the way? And so I think that's extremely important for us to consider as parents. Now, the purpose of education, the purpose of education within a biblical framework is, above all, for the purpose of equipping people to know and understand the Christian faith and empowering them to live it out, that the world may be transformed for the glory of God and the good of mankind. So I really like to look at the Webster's 1828 dictionary because Webster had a biblical worldview. Things have changed a lot. So according to the Webster 1828 dictionary definition of education, education involves all the instruction and discipline needed to enlighten the understanding, correct the temper, and form the manners and habits of youth, and fit them for usefulness in their future stations. And it continues, to give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable, and an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties. Webster's wisdom was based on the presupposition that the Bible is the foundation of truth. And unlike today's definition of education, the original definition reflected a biblical worldview. Well, the Greek versus the Hebrew method are important because today we use more of a Greek model, but we should look at the Hebrew method simply because that is the method that we are shown in the Bible. And so when it comes to education, the Greek method, subjects are compartmentalized and they're based on class. So that means multiple things. You know, it might be that you're all people your own age and a grade level, but also it went deeper than this because it really had to do with certain classes of people got different kinds of education, different levels of education. And so, you know, I think that's extremely important when we're thinking about where the origins of our education system are. Also, it was outside the home. You would be taught by somebody else who was a master at, whether it was academics or whether you were in a vocational track or that kind of thing. It was outsourced completely. The Hebrew, in contrast, was that everyone was like-minded in the culture. And so they were all working together towards a common goal of educating the next generation for the glory of God. They knew that in order to keep their society, their religion, their relationship with God, their faith, all of that, that they all needed to work toward that. And in order to pass that on for generations, they were all invested in making sure that the next generation learned things according to the way that God would have them do it. It was pervasive. It was throughout their culture. There wasn't a blocked off time for school per se. It was education is discipleship. And so it was pervasive. Their whole society was centered on bringing the next generation to know the Lord and follow his commands. It was primarily home-based, and family units were the basic building block of that culture. So I believe that now God is raising up a remnant through Christian education, through Christian schools, and through homeschooling. Well, what are some practical steps when it comes to a biblical worldview and passing that on? First thing I would encourage you to do is examine the curriculum before you buy it, before you just choose what you're going to have your children study. You want to examine that curriculum. Is it consistent with the biblical worldview? Keep in mind, nothing is truly neutral. Everything has either a biblical worldview or not. It may not be obvious, but a lot of times it's more obvious when it doesn't have a biblical worldview. It's not consistent with Scripture. And so it should promote godly character. It should relate Scripture to ideas, not just, you don't just want Bible stories. You want to be able to relate those Bible stories to other things. And you want to not just look at Bible stories, but you want to look at principles. You want to look at the whole counsel of God. And so you've got to relate those to ideas so that your students, your children, can do that themselves. That is what discipleship is all about. And we need to begin with the presupposition that the Bible is true. So God's wisdom is higher than ours, and his ways are higher than ours. Isaiah 55:8 tells us. So sometimes we can't explain something, and that's okay. It's okay to tell our kids that. But we want to let them know that we know this because the Bible says this, So we know that fossil is not a billion years old because the Bible is not consistent with that. So to equip children with a biblical worldview, we want to, of course, teach them the truth. And that makes sense. That seems like it would go without saying, but this part might be a little more surprising or counterintuitive. We want to teach them the opposition. And we want to teach them to combat that opposition with truth. It's kind of like giving them a taste of the opposition while they are still under our counsel and our influence, so that we can then train them how they might handle that when they come into the quote unquote real world and have to deal with people who are truly opposed to them. We need to teach them to recognize truth and error. It's so easy for kids to, or even adults, to just believe what they hear or what they see or what the media says. And so it's so important for us to equip them to think critically. So here's an example that a lot of people may not understand or realize or even connect. And actually, it's really very applicable right this very minute in our history. And that is that Darwin used the theory of evolution to promote racism. In fact, the title of Origin of Species has a case for the favored races in its full title. So that's important. We need to teach our children that because a lot of times they're not going to hear that anywhere else. But I don't expect you to take my word for it. Check the facts for yourself. And then, many of our issues of our time are linked to Genesis 1 through 11. And the majority of those in Genesis 1 through 3. So think about it: racism, LGBTQ, abortion, marriage, evolution. It all started with, did God really say? And we still hear that today. But if our children don't know the Bible, they might go, no, maybe he didn't, or well, he did, but we don't really have to follow that. We need to they need to be able to emphatically say, yes, he did say that, and therefore that's what I'm going to follow. Or no, he didn't say that, you're twisting his words. But they won't know if somebody brings in a subtle difference. They may not recognize it unless they really know the scripture. So my personal salvation experience was greatly influenced by understanding a literal interpretation of Genesis. And so I would just tell you that it's extremely important. And that is why, in many cases, it is being attacked in our culture today. Well, one thing I would really advise, and I think this is extremely important, is to model what you believe. We need to do that. We can tell people all day long what we believe, and we should, but modeling it is just as important. And so our content, our communication, and our conduct must be consistent. That's from Kingdom Education by Glenn Schultz, an excellent read. Edgar Guest said this, and I think it's great. I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one should walk with me than merely tell the way. The eye is a better pupil and more willing than the ear. Fine counsel is confusing, but examples always clear. And the best of all the preachers are the men who live their creeds. For to see good put in action is what everybody is important in understanding how we got where we are today, and also why it's important to home educate or use a Christian school. There's a lot that has gone on behind the scenes that most people are not aware of at this point. So the Common School movement was started by Horace Mann, a Unitarian, in the 1840s. And one of the things that he said was, if American taxpayers could provide education for every child in America, Within a short period of time, the effect of the public school system would empty all the jails and prisons in the country. Let the home and church teach faith and values, and the school teach facts. Okay, well, what do you think? How's that working out? Another father of the current American education public schools is John Dewey. He was a constructivist. He was a humanist, and so he was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. He believed that democracy and education are interdependent, that education must take place in community or groups, and that we can construct meaning, that actually meaning evolves and truth evolves, and we can construct that, and that we should encourage our children to do that in groups of their peers. Schools, he believed, are microcosms of the society, and I'm not sure that I would argue with him on that, but he believed that we should begin with familiar things and increase in complexity, and the teachers should not impose their values on the children. I think that's really important. Teachers should not impose their values, is what he believed. He believed that children would actually do the right thing if given the right conditions. Now, if you have ever asked your children to do something and left the room and come back and it's not done, or they've broken out in an argument with each other, you know that's probably not true. But think about putting a bunch of 5-year-olds in a room and expecting them to come back and do the right thing without direction. Well, Dewey and Darwin were contemporaries, and they were naturalists, and so they believed that science is the basis of truth, and humans are merely biological organisms, that the natural world is the only reality. There is no spiritual world. And humanists believe that faith in God is misguided. They don't look forward to eternity, but they put their faith and effort into science. And they desire to create a better reality in the present world. And they think that we need to be set free from words like ought and should. They sought to change the culture through education. They believed that they could do that. And I would say that they were right. Well, in contrast, a biblical worldview education is redemptive. So we know that humans are fallen, but we know that we can be redeemed through Christ. And we believe that first the family is the influence on the children, then the church becomes responsible. So the family and the church are the pervasive top influences in raising children. Children are seen as created in God's image, but that doesn't mean that they're seen as good in and of themselves. It's good to have children, but they're not innately good. And we believe that their greatest need and ours is to see Jesus as Lord and Savior. This is not a compartmentalized education, but it's holistic. It's not schooling, it's education, it's discipleship. And Jesus, we've talked a lot about the Old Testament, the New Testament. Jesus welcomed the children, and his teaching style was conversational. He discipled his disciples, by living with them and walking among them and showing them how to do what they were supposed to do, how they should live. So Deuteronomy 6 provides a model of education that is likewise relational, conversational, and related to everyday life. Parents were given the task of discipling their children in the ordinary context of life. And the goal was to pass their faith on to the next generation. So homeschool parents have a real opportunity to live out these biblical principles. And therefore, they need to understand and apply the biblical mandate with methods and practices in line with the biblical worldview. Well, I want to show you something called the Gen 2 survey, which was created by the National Home Education Research Institute. So I'm going to need to get on to their page real quick. Okay. So this was a survey of Christian millennials, and you can see the average age of a participant was 27. They surveyed 9,369 millennials, and that would be 30% male, 70% female. And then they showed which method of education was used for 7 years or more. They had to use, it had to be 7 years. They felt like it wouldn't be effective to comment on less than that. And so those who were homeschooled comprised 43%, and public school 45%. And then you had some Christian schoolers and a few private school students that were not in Christian school. Okay. And then we have some other things. So 82% of the young people who had been homeschooled plan to use homeschooling for at least part of their children's education. The percent of homeschooled millennials with strong Christian beliefs was 87%. And then they tended to rate their homeschool experience pretty well, pretty favorably, very positive or positive on the academics, very positive and positive on the social. Very few were negative on it, but there were some. And then to the question, I'm glad I was homeschooled, 67% strongly agreed, and then you had another 18% that agreed, and then some that were neutral. But if you look, you've got about 85% that it agreed with the statement, I'm glad I was homeschooled. Now, those who had worldview training, no matter whether they were, I think this was regardless of their educational choice, were 90% more likely to be believers, 98% more likely to be stronger in their Christian behavior, and 122% more likely to be stronger in their Christian beliefs. So what does that mean? This shows the relationship between various inputs into a child's life and the influence on their behavior as adults. So these pluses, those are positives. The more pluses you have, obviously, the better. And then you have some negatives would be represented by red lines, minus signs. So when you look at this, the things that were very predictive of having a biblical worldview and having behaviors that were consistent with that would be having a strong relationship with your father and with your mother, and with attending church at an early age and at an older age, and then homeschooling. Homeschooling was the only educational choice that really gave positives across the board. It didn't seem to have an effect on their civic involvement, but Christian schooling was the only one that had a positive there. But if you look at this, when it comes to orthodoxy, Christian behavior as adults, Christian beliefs as adults, satisfaction in life as an adult, beliefs similar to their fathers and beliefs similar to their mothers, homeschooling is the only educational choice that even gave positives in those areas. In Christian schools, actually gave them a negative, as did private school, and then public school, obviously, lots of negatives. But when I read this, I was really pretty surprised by that. I expected for Christian schools to have some positives on this. And so I'm not saying anything against Christian school. I do think that Christian school is a worthwhile endeavor for us as Christians. And I do think that it has some dependence on how much of a biblical worldview is taught at that Christian school. So anyway, but it's very noteworthy about the homeschooling percentages. And then when it comes to the specific influence of education on their lives, a homeschooled student is 223% more likely to be a believer, or as likely to be as likely to be a believer as those attending Christian school, more likely. And then 171% more likely than those in Christian school to be stronger in Christian behavior, 223% more likely than a Christian school student to be stronger in their beliefs, and then less likely to be sexually abused. And then a homeschooled student is 621% more likely than those in private school, and 254% more likely than those in public school to be a believer. And then I'm really just going to look at the public school statistics, but 209% likely to be stronger in Christian behavior, 284% more likely to be stronger in Christian beliefs, and 257 less likely to be sexually abused than those in public school. So I think these statistics are very compelling. And honestly, there's not a huge deficit between the Christian school and the public school. But definitely seems advantageous to homeschool. And I believe that is because God designed the family to disciple the children. So anyway, that's the Gen 2 study. And I would encourage you to look at that yourself and take some time to really study it, because it is compelling. All right, so I'm going to head back over to my PowerPoint. Okay, so when it comes to a biblical worldview education, I would say this. Like Dan Egler from ACSI, John Dewey and Horace Mann, the fathers of the American public school movement, they understood the power of worldview in education. Dewey and his colleagues who signed the first Humanist Manifesto believed that education would help change the tide of society by discouraging the sentimental and unreal hopes and wishful thinking of traditional religion. They said the time has passed for theism. They ushered in a new religion called humanism. And yes, they themselves called it religious humanism. Today we call it secular humanism. But secularism is a religion. And so these men knew that education was the key to redefining the worldview of our nation. And they have succeeded. Our public schools have taught with a humanistic worldview now for several generations, and have also incorporated some postmodern thought. And so the result, even if we are living the Christian life at home and home educating our children in their non-school hours, we are losing them to secular humanism and postmodernism and essentially atheism. Even if they are not necessarily claiming to be atheists, a lot of them are functional atheists, meaning there is no God, even if they proclaim that there is one. So how many of us would say, yes, I would send my child to a Muslim school if that's all there was available to us? I think most of us would say no. But we are finding that we are so likely to send them to a school that is dedicated to secular humanism and postmodernism. But we think that we can do that and come out with solid Christian children. Well, no matter what you're to provide your children with a biblical worldview education. Just because a child goes to a Christian school or is homeschooled, that doesn't automatically provide a biblical worldview. We need to work at it. We need to have that ourselves. We need to, and we start by just being in the Word. And then there are books and things that we can read to help carry that a little further if we want to. But the first place to be is in the Word, and then applying that to our lives and to our children's lives. So we always need to keep in mind that we as parents are responsible ultimately for our children's education. We will stand before God one day and give an account for that. And so we need to know what He says about it and practice what He says about it. So we should view education as holistic and purposive toward enabling students to know God and defend their beliefs. And it is a supreme privilege to be able to partner with God to help impart a biblical worldview to the next generation. And God will honor our efforts. I know that doesn't mean that they will become believers, but as we can see statistically, it's much more likely. And it is our responsibility to share that with them, to share the truth with them, to raise them on the truth. And if we do so, we can trust God with the outcome. Well, you are more than welcome. I'm going to actually share my reference pages in case you would want to look into any of those yourself. And then you are more than welcome to reach out to me if you would like to for more information or any questions that you might have. And so I will pause on this for a minute so that you can screenshot it or whatever you would want to do. Right. Okay. Well, thanks again, and I will, if you are viewing this on Facebook or YouTube, I will put my contact information in the comments so that you can reach out to me if you would like. And thank you for the privilege of being able to speak with you today. And I pray that it was a blessing to you. And just keep in mind, you can do this. If you decide that you're homeschooling and God has called you to that, you certainly can do this. And so I hope that your day is blessed and that your coming academic discipleship year is blessed as well.